Okay, good morning. My name is Yosef, Kebede. As you can see, the title of this lecture is Miracle or Mirage, the truth behind the African opportunity. And when we say opportunity, we're talking about business opportunity. So in this talk, I'm going to confirm some assumptions or perceptions or even maybe stereotypes that you may have about Africa. And then I'm going to totally destroy these assumptions and stereotypes. But then at the back end, I'm going to validate them again. So by the time we finish with this lecture, if you feel that you have a very firm and assured grasp about what Africa has in terms of business opportunities, then I haven't done a good job. We haven't met our objectives. But on the other side, if you actually come out of this lecture with some sense of wonder or even an unfamiliar appetite about what Africa may have to provide you as far as opportunities, then I think we've met our objectives. Because the reality is the topic of business in Africa is a very complex, very layered issue. There are several complexities that's really hard to grasp what's really going on unless you're really immersed in the situation itself. And so short of full immersion, what I hope to do is kind of give you a good, rational, balanced perspective. And with that, I hope that it will at least serve as a pretext for dialogue and maybe even address that fear of the unknown that so often plagues any topic related to Africa. So with that, you're probably wondering, why and how I may be qualified to address this issue. So as a way of introduction, like I said, my name is Yosef Kebede. I'm the managing director and founder of a HR management consulting company called BTG Group, LLC. The focus of the company is HR management consulting, professional development and training, as well as research and business facilitation services, primarily in East Africa. I myself am from East Africa, born and raised in Ethiopia, lived in Tanzania, Botswana, before finally immigrating to the US back in 1988. I have a BS and MS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford University in California. And then I also have an international MBA degree from the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. By the way, the Darla Moore School of Business is the third-ranked international business program in the country. So that's, I guess you could say that's my qualification. So before we actually start this journey, as you can see, this is formed or formatted in the form of a journey that I'll hope to take you on. Before we begin, I'm going to start with a very trivial comment that may sound silly. Africa is a continent. It is not a country. And I feel the need to say that because in any dialogue, in any discussion or articles that you may read about Africa, there's a tendency among even the experts to refer to it as this one big giant block. The reality is there are 53 to 54 sovereign nations, each with their own issues and histories and cultures, unique conditions that really makes it difficult or makes it absurd to refer to the continent as one big block. But in this presentation, from time to time, I'm going to talk about Africa. For the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to delve into each particular region, but I just want to mention that so you can have a clear understanding of the real complexity that we're dealing with. Okay, so as we start this journey, I just want to start off by leading us on the explaining the agenda. We'll start out with chapter 1, discussing kind of at a broad level emerging markets in general and the role of multinational corporations in these markets. Then we'll answer the question of can anything good come out of Africa. Then we'll look at really the challenge of achieving balance. There are really two narratives about Africa that are out there right now. And we'll address these two narratives to get some balance. We'll look at specific individuals and initiatives and companies in Africa now that are actually leading a new paradigm shift in terms of business on the continent. And then finally, we'll just conclude with some observations. Okay? So, chapter 1. The McKinsey Global Institute is the research arm of McKinsey consulting company. And a couple of years ago, they came out with a comprehensive report that looked at the role of large cities throughout the world and kind of mapped the economic power of urban centers. And particularly looked at where companies were forming, where large companies were being established. And by large, we mean over $1 billion in revenue. And what they found is, based on a trend analysis, that by the year 2025, they expect that there will be over 7,000 brand new large companies that will be formed. And the vast majority of these 7,000 will actually be from emerging economies. It's important because if you think about what the next 10 to 15 years holds, what we're looking at is a complete shift in terms of the economic power based on where these companies are coming from. And it should be also noted that the primary correlation as far as where these companies are being established is GDP. So basically, where their GDP growth is high, there's going to be a large middle class, there's going to be a large consumer base, so that's where those companies are being established. Looked at through the lens of the Forbes 500, currently we're looking at about 26% of the Forbes 500 companies that are based in emerging markets. By 2025, we will see close to half of these companies being based in emerging markets. And I know this chart is kind of hard to read, but you can see the progression, and the red, the purple, the yellow represent the Chinese, Latin American, Indian regions where these companies are going to be based. Okay? And again, the primary determinant is the burgeoning middle class or the GDP growth. Now, if we look at the term emerging market, I think the classical definition that we all are aware of, emerging is those BRIC nations, the Brazils, the Russias, the Indias, the Chinas. Then you might sprinkle in there some Turkey, maybe some South Koreans, Chileans, but generally that's what we understand to be an emerging market. But if we look at the actual classic definition, or the Webster's definition of emerge, see, emerge means to become apparent, important, or prominent, to recover from or survive a difficult or demanding situation. So I propose to you that if we go by this definition, there are several African nations that can actually be classified legitimately as emerging markets. And I further propose that if we look at where some of these African nations are today, we can really equate to where China and India were 10 to 15 years ago. So it's interesting to look at where China and India have come from and look at their trajectory and kind of extrapolate and see where some of these African nations may be in the next 10 to 15 years. So it's important for multinational corporations to understand the shift, right? Emerging markets are where it's at. If you are an executive, if you are in charge of strategy for company expansion, if you are not incorporating emerging markets into your strategic analysis, then you have, I would dare say, a flawed analysis, because we are looking at a different world by 2025, 2030, and so on and so forth. So, but the reality is also that many companies have tried to enter new markets, in new emerging markets, and economies. And it's not easy, right? It doesn't even have to be into an emerging market. Any new market entry is fraught with pitfalls and risks, and we know that there have been a lot of starts and stops along the way. But when we look particularly at emerging markets, the challenge there is, okay, you have a burgeoning middle class. That's the main reason why these companies are going in there, to access this consumer base. So if you're going to do that, you're going to be competing against incumbents who've been there and done that, who kind of have the market locked up, so to speak. So as a multinational corporation, as a new entrant, how are you going to compete effectively? So the challenge then is in being able to localize the value chain. And by that we mean looking at your consumer base and being able to respond to the needs of that particular unique needs of that consumer base, the new middle class, or the next billionaires they're called. Because the unique aspect of this next billion, the new consumer base, is that they have discriminating tastes, but they're also still price sensitive. So localizing your value chain is critical so that you are able to compete on price as well as quality. But absolutely, early adaptation is critical, which is why I'm saying if you look at where some of these African nations are today, and equate that to where China and India were yesterday, being there early, being in Africa as early as possible is absolutely critical. So at the end of the day, we're faced with this issue of, as an MNC, being able to deliver more value for less cost, because you have price-sensitive consumers, for more consumers, the next billion. So we talked about risks in emerging markets. Just to hit that again, so the failures, you can, I'm sure, read through case studies and various literature what some of these failures are. For example, GM, when they first started exporting cars to India, their cars weren't drivable on Indian streets. Monsanto tried to export their model of selling genetically modified seeds or requiring farmers to purchase their seeds. That didn't go too well for them in Africa, simply because of the culture and the custom of African farmers to save seed. So those sorts of risks are rampant, and the mistakes are out there for us to kind of learn from. There are cultural mistakes. Like, this is a picture of Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates shaking the hand of the Prime Minister of South Korea. In the U.S., shaking a hand there's no thought that goes into it. Well, in South Korea and other parts of Asia, there's a little bit more expression, bowing, perhaps, gesticulation that is needed. They didn't do that, and that's kind of like a faux pas that some businesses commit when they go overseas. But by and large, these are relatively minor because they're really in the control of the people that are going overseas. I mean, you can establish R&D centers. You can teach your people about the customs of the new country that you're going into. So that's primarily easy to take care of, or relatively easy to take care of. But I think the third issue, which is actually kind of near and dear to my heart as far as what we're doing in East Africa, is human resource capacity. If you are going to enter a new market, it doesn't matter if it's overseas. It could just be going to Des Moines, Iowa from Atlanta, Georgia. Your challenge will be finding the right people to do your bidding, the right people to actually manage, the right people to operate, and the right people to continue to affect the bottom line. Well, if you think about that in the emerging market context, then suddenly that whole issue of human resource capacity is amplified. And really, it's an issue of is there buy-in and is there investment on the part of those governments in the countries that you're going into to address the needs, the human resource capacity needs? Are there universities? Is there the training equivalent to what you would expect in your home country? For their part, several countries have, there is buy-in, and several countries have made an investment in education, an investment in training. Tanzania is a good example, a country I go to quite often. Over the past 10 years, they have opened up more universities than they had in the 40 years since independence. So you see there's investment, but by and large, Tanzania, even though it's probably the most attractive country in terms of investment in that region, the labor pool is not as productive or not as competitive as its regional partners. So what this leaves you as an executive to think about is, how are you going to address the issue of human resource capacity when you enter an emerging market? There's no one silver bullet, no easy, simple answer, but by and large, I think what the solution entails is a productive collaboration among the private sector, the governments, educational institutions, for example, business schools like Georgia Tech, with schools in the emerging economy, and then finally multilateral and bilateral organizations. So now that we've kind of already touched on the topic of Africa, now we're going to delve in a little bit deeper into Africa in particular and try to answer the question of, can anything good come out of Africa? You're probably thinking there, is there anything in Africa that can add value to me or to my company? Is there anything of relevance within Africa? And my simple answer would be yes. It is relevant. There is a lot of opportunity there, but it takes, again, like I said, full immersion. But before we even begin, to kind of harken back to the comment I made earlier, this is an illustration of the bigness of Africa. If you look at this, you can see that within the geographic boundaries of the continent, you can fit in China, the U.S., India, and Western Europe and still have space. It's important, again, because this illustrates, I think, how massive of an opportunity we're looking at, but how massive of a puzzle we have to solve. It's really a puzzle. It's huge. So you can't really talk about an African strategy and be serious. No more than you can talk about a European strategy without really breaking it down to, a strategy in France, a strategy in Germany, so on and so forth. So we know the common perceptions that most people have about Africa. Coming from Africa, I mean, I dealt with this as a new immigrant. The wars, the famines, the corruption, these are all that we know. No need to belabor the point. But to kind of counter that, some highlights, some points that you may not have known. For example, 7 out of the 10 of the fastest growing economies in the time frame of 2011 through 2015 are African. 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world. Among the 50 economies that have shown the biggest improvement in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, a full third of them are on the African continent, the largest share by far of any other region in the world. 35 countries are ahead of China in the EIU's Democracy Index. 35 countries are ahead of Russia in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. And then finally, Africa has the fastest growing middle class in the world. So the Economist report on GDP growth, again, to just kind of reinforce the comparison between Asian countries and African countries, the trend has been quite interesting, where you've seen now in the last couple of years African economies in aggregate overtaking Asian countries or Asian economies in GDP growth, and the trend seems to be continuing pretty fast. So currently the collective GDP of the continent is about 2 trillion, and in less than 10 years we're looking at it being 2.6. Looking at it 15 years from now or 20 years from now, that GDP number will double. Currently, over 500 million people are working age population. Working age defined by ages between 18 and 60. By 2040, Africa will have the largest working age population in the world. This is absolutely significant. This is absolutely critical, because now you're looking at a massive number of people on a large continent that are slated to be productive parts of economies. And then when you look at the positive implications beyond that, to the improvement in quality of life, to the improvement in stability because unemployment numbers are going down, the impacts are huge. Okay, so that's a very interesting number. And then the total consumer spending is expected to double by 2020. Just a brief aside on this particular metric here. When we look at consumer spending in Africa, we should always take into account that there is an African diaspora that is very involved in the economies of their home countries. So people like me, for example, born and raised in East Africa, going back, that contributes to that expanding and burgeoning middle class. So the role of the diaspora living in the US, the diaspora living in Europe and other parts of the world, and their returnee status is very critical in terms of assessing the future of Africa. So this is a chart just kind of comparing that consumer spending projection to 2020 with the BRIC nations. As you can see, all the BRICs are doubling at least, and so is Africa, which is in the red. So, I mentioned the diaspora. Washington Post article recently cited a census data that showed that the children of African immigrants are more likely to be college educated, okay, than any other immigrant group in the U.S. or U.S.-born ethnic group, including white Americans. So, and this data is actually corroborated if you look at the UK, for example, where Africans are actually the most highly educated of all immigrant groups. So I say it in words, but I think also in pictures can do it justice. Some pictures of some large cities on the African continent. If you look at Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, this could look like a city anywhere in the U.S. This is Lagos, sailing in Lagos, Nigeria. Maputo is the capital city of Mozambique. And Johannesburg is in South Africa, of course. So, when we talk about the middle class in Africa, is this real? Are we talking about a reality? By the way, this picture and this next picture, these are not families here in Atlanta, Georgia. I didn't pick this up from the AJC. These are actual pictures from people living on the continent. Okay, so the middle class, we are talking about a real dynamic going on, and it's borne out and evidenced by the fact that there are several infrastructure projects that are going on today as we speak that are designed to accommodate this burgeoning middle class. So, for example, Eco Atlantic is a development project in Nigeria, multi-billion-dollar project. It's a mixed-use residential business. It's going to be built on reclaimed land right on the Atlantic Ocean. Looking at accommodating over 250,000 people and creating about 150,000 jobs. And it's a private venture. So hopefully you can see this clearly. The one on the left is an artist's rendition of what the project is going to look like when it's finished. Excuse me. As you can see, this looks very similar to some of the projects that are being done in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the Middle East. And as you can see, the construction has already began. Going across the continent to Kenya, right outside Nairobi, there is what they're dubbing the Africa Silicon Savannah. It's a high-tech haven, so to speak, a multi-billion-dollar development, tech-focused. So very similar to how Costa Rica, when they were attracting the semiconductor companies in the U.S., built out special economic zones to attract them. Similar thing going on in Nairobi. So over 100,000 jobs are expected to be started by 2030, and it's a public-private venture. And again, some artist renditions of Konza. Going back out to the west, right outside of Accra, Ghana, Hope City is another tech hub. It's going to be comprised of 6 towers that form a 75-story building that will ultimately be the tallest structure on the African continent. 25,000 residents and over 50,000 jobs, another private venture. And then in Rwanda, the city of Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda, has a very ambitious master plan to build a smart city that's very sustainable, mixed use, residential, commercial, and it's being done with the participation of various stakeholders around the world. And then being from Ethiopia, I just wanted to make sure that Ethiopia wasn't left out of this. The Ethiopian Space Science Society, I just found this out recently myself, but there is a space program, and the mission behind that space program is to see Ethiopia become active in the field, not only as a passive user, but a contributor in astronomy, space science, and technology. So all this to kind of drive home the point that when we talk about a middle class and a paradigm shift on the African continent, there are some concrete developments going on to validate that particular fact. So, as with all things, when you're high up, gravity typically tends to bring you down. That don't necessarily mean to bring us down in terms of the optimism regarding Africa, but I want to bring some balance to this discussion, right? And like I mentioned at the beginning, there are really 2 narratives that seem to be swirling around when we discuss Africa and the opportunities involved in the development of Africa. The first narrative is that what we see, all the development, all the progress, all the economic vitality is based on a diverse array of sectors and industries, and that it's truly sustainable, and that we have truly come around the corner. The other narrative is that not so fast. There are a lot of questions about the sustainability of it. There are a lot of questions about the fact that the growth is really uneven in terms of the fact that the gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow pretty wide. So the McKinsey Global Institute, in terms of their contribution to the thought leadership in this area, apparently are very much in the first camp. in terms of touting the fact that there is a very widespread and diverse array of industries that are involved and that are contributing to GDP growth, economic vitality on the continent. So as you can see from this chart, resources or commodities like oil and gas contribute the largest percentage to the GDP collectively at about 24%. But beyond that, there's representation from wholesale, construction, real estate, tourism, manufacturing. So that's one side of the coin. Now going on the other side, Afro Barometer is a very innovative and I guess you could say groundbreaking initiative that over the span of a decade plus collected data to assess again the economic impact on the people on the ground. So the actual average person on the ground, how are you feeling? Is the economic growth actually impacting your day-to-day life? And so in their data, what they have found is that, comparing it from the early 2000s to now, as you can see, there's a very marginal impact to poverty level. Okay, the top line is actually moderate poverty, and the bottom line is extreme poverty. And as you can see, in either case, the change, the decrease in extreme poverty rates and moderate poverty rates is very minimal. So the point made is that again the gaps continue to widen, and the impact on overall poverty or alleviation schemes is very minimal. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa just came out with a report this year assessing the role of commodities and resources and the need for a change in approach and development model based on these commodities for the African continent. And I typically don't put up words and read words on a slide, but I just wanted to point this out because it's important to kind of catch the discrepancy or the contrast. In that report, they say, growth has been widely shared and remains strong across the majority of African countries, despite the disruptive impact of the global economic and financial crisis and the political turmoil in North Africa. More than a third of African countries grew at 5% or more in 2012, with a large proportion achieving this rate over 2010 to 2012. This underscores the growing potential of African countries to accelerate and then sustain growth in the foreseeable future. So clearly that's in the first camp of optimism, if you will, regarding Africa's growth. The next statement they state in their report is the limited impact of commodity-driven growth on employment and social development has been aggravated by liberalizing reforms and globalization that, in the absence of serious government policies to promote the economy's productive capacities and ability to compete in international markets, have left a legacy of inappropriate incentives and institutions that threaten economic and political stability as well as social cohesion. Quite a mouthful, but the interesting thing about it is this one report seemingly has a bipolar makeup when it comes to assessing the development in Africa. But again, this speaks to the complexity of what's going on. But to kind of hit on the main topic of that particular report, which is commodities and resources, one of the most obvious characteristics, if you will, about the African continent is that it is rich in resources. The abundance of resources on the African continent are really second to none. 3/4 of the world's platinum supply is on the continent. Half of the world's diamonds and chromium is on the continent. 1/5 of gold and uranium. There are significant oil and gas reserves in 30 countries. And as of just a couple of years ago, 12 countries are now slated to become major oil and gas producers on par with the ones that are now already producing. Okay, so there's the issue of resources and commodities is not in question. It's what we do with that. So one of the points, or one of the challenges with the fact that a lot of African countries are endowed with resources is that this over-reliance on resources in the absence of strong, stable macroeconomic policies and good governance leads to what people have dubbed the resource curse. As I'm sure many of you have heard or have read about, the resource curse really translates to a rich country in terms of resources being embroiled in turmoil and strife for decades. A great example would be the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. It's right in the heart of Africa, probably the richest country on the continent in terms of resources, but has been unstable for such a long time. The UN just issued a report recently where they noted that the DRC lost over $1 billion US in 5 deals, in resource deals, in which state mining assets were sold at below market value based on backroom deals and under the table source of dealings. Okay, so this is what happens. This is an issue that impacts the day-to-day lives of people. But another issue that is also critical when it comes to resources is that, again, this over-reliance on just natural resources, be it oil, gas, or minerals, creates one-dimensional economies. One-dimensional economies where you're basically digging it up out of the ground and exporting it. You dig it up, you send it out. You dig it up, you send it out. There is no value addition in the process, you are left with a very low value input when it comes to your development model. And this is kind of clearly seen when you look at this chart of coffee, the retail price of coffee. So here's data collected from all the way back to the 1960s up to the early 2000s. So as you see, the blue is the value added in the consuming country, be it in Europe or the US. The yellow at the top is basically what the grower's price is. So the majority of the value added, the majority of the price and the value extracted from the sale of that coffee, obviously goes to the entity that adds value to that particular product, that resource. So the countries, the original countries, the resource countries are left with just a sliver of the total value. Looked at another way, we look at diamonds and value addition in diamonds. As we know, diamonds go through several stages before they actually end up at Kay's Jewelers. So when it actually ends up at Kay's Jewelers, the retail value is over 320% of the value of the original value of that rough diamond that you find in the ground. So what this really means is that African nations that are over-reliant on resources are leaving money on the table, literally leaving money on the table, because they do not have the capacity to add value and kind of move up the value chain when it comes to products. So the interesting thing about this, though, is there is definitely a paradigm shift and an interest now on many parties, from individual governments to the United Nations, to transform the model in these African economies to become more high value adding economies, where there is an established paradigm of not just extracting, but also extracting and manufacturing. Because at the end of the day, what you do have is you are going to have a large consumer base. So now no longer are your customers only in Europe and the US. For example, your diamonds, you're not only going to be selling it there now. With a burgeoning middle class, you're going to have customers there. So it's in your benefit as a country, but more importantly as a company, to have a very well-established backward and forward link to establish a value-adding economy. So as you can see, the process is very simple to follow. You have low-value exports, which is where Africans have kind of been how they've been operating for a very long time, moving up to a value chain localization, where you have the involvement of MNCs involved in backward and forward links in cluster format with suppliers, distributors, and what have you, and all the way up to where you are actually adding value, high value, and exporting that high value product to a consumer base outside. And the Sloan Management Review, the MIT Sloan Management Review recently published an article where they analyzed the role of MNCs in China and India particularly. And between 2003 and 2007, what they found is that there were over 1,000 R&D centers that were established in China and India by these MNCs. And the reason for that, again, is the role of the middle class and the need to access this consumer base and the need to localize the value chain. So, like I said, if we believe that Africa today is where China and Africa were 10 to 15 years ago, this is definitely a trend that we need to be aware of and a trend that MNCs can take advantage of. So moving on to chapter 4, as we're coming to a close, as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of highlight certain people and companies that were in the forefront of this new shift and a new, what they call the African miracle. Danladi Berijan is the managing director and founder of Barrowed Capital. Barrowed is an equity investment company in Lagos, Nigeria. He's a Stanford grad, so he was a colleague of mine. A Harvard MBA, a former Citibank VP, started the Barrowed back in 2008 to invest in growth companies. They have a portfolio of about 8 companies and a controlling stake in about 3. 7-fold return on investment, and looking to expand beyond Nigeria. And they're really operating in a space where now you have companies like Blackstone and Carlyle Group here from the US that are now entering that market of equity investment in Nigeria, looking for these upstart startup companies, that have a lot of promise, and investing in them, growing them, and expanding them. Barrowed is also the lead in a consortium that won a $202 billion contract to build Nigeria's first light rail project. This is absolutely groundbreaking because it's going to be built in Lagos. The country, and actually Sub-Saharan Africa, does not have a light rail system in any of the large cities. So what this project is going to do is basically connect this huge metropolis. Lagos is probably the largest city on the continent. And so Barrowed is the lead in a consortium that's getting this done, and they should be, they've already started construction and will hopefully be finished in about 10 years. The next person to feature is Edward Amartetago. He is the co-founder of Nani Mobile. Nani Mobile is it used to be called Rightline. It's a platform that was originally set up to allow customers to interface with businesses and provide feedback. That's the name Rightline. And it's evolved to becoming a company that now establishes a platform for businesses to provide, to advertise, and that's how they generate revenue. He's got a very interesting story. He was a vendor for a telecom company in Ghana, made a lot of money doing that private distribution, sold that company, and then enrolled in an entrepreneurial education company or organization called Meltwater Entrepreneurship School of Technology, MEST, in Accra, Ghana. And as going through the curriculum, he came up with the idea for Nani Mobile along with his partners. And in 2011, they actually won the Best Business Award at Launch Conference in San Francisco. Important again to note that this conference was a conference where they were competing against startup tech companies from around the world and not just Africa. So these guys are definitely front runners in the technology space, and some of the accolades that they've acquired over the last 2 or 3 years, as you can see in this slide. The next person is Solomon Nagash. He is actually a faculty member at the Coles College of Business here at Kennesaw State. And he's originally from Ethiopia, and he is the owner of Tech Solutions. So kind of back to the original comment about high-value work and knowledge-based economies, and that being the next frontier for African economies. What his company does is they do IT outsourcing. So for example, now they're working for a client here in the US that had a legacy ERP system. They were moving over to a new system, didn't have any data on the legacy system. So now his team in Ethiopia, team made up of electrical and computer scientists, electrical engineers and computer scientists, they're reverse engineering the process and delivering for the client the new platform, the new ERP system. So again, you know, we saw India being a major player in the outsourcing industry, and now with Solomon and what he's doing in Ethiopia, we can see that to be more of a, we'll see that be more of a common occurrence as companies, as he's also expanding beyond Ethiopia. We'll see more of that happening throughout the continent. Frank Oyuga, a Nigerian American, owned a construction company in the Maryland area, and now runs a company in Nigeria called Hatton Corporation. They deal in agriculture, in equipment leasing, solar distribution and installation, construction services. Again, focusing on the value-added portion of this whole thing. Cassava is a crop, a staple crop in Nigeria that his company owns acres of land to farm. And instead of going the traditional route of farming and just exporting or taking to a market the crop, they're adding value by processing it into what they call high-quality cassava flour. The government has mandated that 50% of wheat flour that is imported will need to incorporate high-quality cassava flour, or HQCF. So what his company now is doing is they're kind of on the forefront of this whole shift of import substitution. So the ability to process cassava flour at that level, adding value at that high level, will have the impact of import substitution and allow the country to be less reliant on wheat imports. And so finally, I wanted to feature BTG, as I mentioned. The overall vision for the company is to be the go-to provider of HR management consulting services for small to medium-sized organizations in East Africa, and also to be a go-to provider of business facilitation and market intelligence services for US-based companies that are moving to that region. And so over the past year and a half, what we've done with BTG is conduct professional development workshops for Tanzanian professionals, work with small to medium-sized clients addressing their HR and management needs. So I hope that kind of gives you a picture of the involvement of various types of actors in the role of developing the continent. As you can see, some are incumbents, so to speak, companies that have been established there by people who are from there. Others are people who are part of the diaspora that have gone back. Okay, so to bring this all home and conclude, I wanted to quickly summarize some of the takeaways from our 4 chapters. So in the first chapter, we looked at a momentum shift that is happening towards emerging markets in terms of the role of large companies, and also proposed the idea that Africa today is where China and India were 15 years ago. And then the concept of more for less for more value for less cost for the next billion. The second chapter looked at African countries that have recorded impressive growth and some of the metrics involved in analyzing that, and then confirmed that there is definitely a middle class, and that's evidenced by the impact and the growth of development projects throughout the continent. Chapter 3, we looked at the 2 narratives, the optimistic and the, I guess you could say, the realistic side. And looked at the paradigm shift between low value exports moving up the value chain to more high value production model, and the opportunity that there is here, not just for the countries, but for the MNCs that are interested in investing on the continent. And then finally looked at the fact that homegrown success with the addition of the diaspora's engagement is really a powerful combination that we need to be aware of. And then finally, my observations from my work there. I really classify the challenges that there are in terms of doing work in Africa into 3 categories. One is institutional voids. The role of the legal system is not as, aside from South Africa really, is not as transparent and ubiquitous as you would find it here in the U.S. So there are a lot of challenges related to that. Things like market research data, not as readily available. Secondly, infrastructure. If it's roads, definitely. The lack of adequate roads, good roads. But then also if you look at IT infrastructure, that is not as readily available. And then finally, human resources. The capacity of the labor force is a huge challenge to be addressed. Second observation is that establishing and maintaining relationships is definitely an art. I suppose that's no different from any business environment, but particularly when you are in Africa, kind of circumventing or addressing the cultural gap itself is a huge challenge, and within that context, to maintain the relationship with the right people is usually a deal breaker or a deal maker. With regards to finding people, we're talking about people to work for you, but also people who are going to be in your link, be it your distributors, be it your suppliers. Finding people who are go-getters, well-connected, and business-minded is absolutely critical. You could have a go-getter, but if that person is not connected, able to open doors for you, obviously that person just has a lot of zeal, but not really adding any value to you. On the flip side, if you have somebody who is well-connected, but they are not very professional or don't really share the professional values that you do, there's a lot of pulling at your hair sort of a scenario going on. So these are some observations that I have, and to finally close it out, is there an African miracle? And going back to the original title of this presentation, the simple answer is yes. To consider where Africa has come from as a continent, and where a lot of these countries have come from, and to see where they are now is truly an amazing feat. It is definitely the next frontier of global business, but it is definitely not for the faint of heart, and requires a lot of chutzpah. So with that, I'll just close with the contact information for here in Atlanta and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania for BTG Group, as well as my personal contact information, and I thank you for listening to this lecture.